Hey listeners, this is Peter and welcome back to the History Shorts. Today's episode is brought to you by the Podcast Republic, your ultimate listening app. Discover and subscribe to thousands of podcasts from around the world. Download Podcast Republic today, available on Google Play and the Apple App Store. Today on History Shorts. The United States of America has overthrown or helped overthrow foreign governments more often than most Americans realize. Sometimes openly, often covertly, sometimes against dictators and sometimes against democratically elected leaders, but almost always with consequences that lasted far longer than anyone predicted. Today we'll talk about some of the more significant times that this happened. We will finish with the history brief and some strange history. A quick word from our sponsors. This day in history. On January 19, 1809, Edgar Allan Poe was born in Boston. Though he died young and struggled throughout his life, Poe would help invent the modern detective story and transform horror and psychological fiction forever. On January 19, 1966, Indira Gandhi became the Prime Minister of India, the country's first woman to hold the office. Her tenure would be marked by sweeping reforms, fierce controversy, and a lasting imprint on Indian politics. Story of the day. From the early 20th century through the Cold War and into the War on Terror, American leaders repeatedly faced the same question. What happens if a foreign government threatens U.S. interests, or might someday do so? Sometimes the threat was communism, sometimes oil, sometimes strategic geography, or weapons of mass destruction, and sometimes prestige. The answers were rarely simple, but again and again the United States chose intervention, believing that removing a leader would restore order, stability, or alignment with American goals. Before we get into the cases that I chose to concentrate on today, because there were more than the ones we'll cover, I should mention that the United States has overthrown, or helped overthrow, or attempted to overthrow at least 10 governments just in the past century, which, apart from what we will discuss today, also include Cuba in 1961, South Vietnam in 1963, Dominican Republic in 1965, and Grenada in 1983. But let's get into some of the more well-known cases, or at least some of the more talked about ones. Let's start with Iran. In 1953, Iran was not a dictatorship. It was a constitutional monarchy with a democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh's great sin, in Western eyes at least, was nationalizing Iran's oil industry, previously dominated by British companies, by the way. Anyway, Britain was furious, the United States was weary, and in a climate of Cold War paranoia, fears mounted that Iran might drift toward the Soviet Union. The CIA, working with British intelligence, launched Operation Ajax. Through propaganda, bribery, staged protests, and political pressure, Mossadegh was overthrown. He was imprisoned, then placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. In his place, the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, returned to power with expanded authority, backed by American support. In the short term, the coup seemed successful. Iran remained aligned with the West, and the oil flowed. But resentment festered, and in 1979 it exploded in a revolution that reshaped the Middle East and U.S.-Iran relations forever. But that is another story. Let's move over to Guatemala in 1954. Guatemala's president, Jacobo Arbenz, was not a communist revolutionary. He was a reformer. His goal was land redistribution, breaking up vast estates and returning unused land to poor farmers. One of these estates belonged to the United Fruit Company, an American corporation with enormous influence in Washington. U.S. officials framed Arbenz as a communist threat. The CIA launched Operation PB Success, using psychological warfare, propaganda, and a small rebel force to create the illusion of an unstoppable uprising. Arbenz resigned. A U.S.-friendly government took over, and reforms were reversed. What followed was not stability, however, but decades of violence. Guatemala descended into civil war, marked by death squads, mass killings, and genocide against indigenous communities. The overthrow removed one government, and it destabilized an entire society. Let's move on to Congo, 1960s. When the Congo gained independence from Belgium in 1960, Patrice Lumumba became its first prime minister. Charismatic and outspoken, Lumumba demanded true sovereignty, including control over the country's immense mineral wealth. The United States viewed him as dangerously unpredictable. When Lumumba sought Soviet assistance amid internal chaos, alarm bells rang in Washington. American intelligence supported efforts to remove him. He was thus arrested, handed over to rivals, and assassinated. In the vacuum that followed, Mobutu Sese Seko emerged, a US-backed strongman who ruled for decades, stealing wealth and hollowing out the state. The Congo was no longer a Cold War risk. It was a humanitarian tragedy. Which brings us to Chile, 1973. Chile did something rare in Latin America in 1970. It elected a Marxist president, Salvador Allende, through democratic means. The United States feared that the president's success would inspire similar movements across the region. President Nixon ordered efforts to make Chile's economy scream, and I quote. Anyway, economic pressure, covert funding of opposition groups, and political destabilization followed. In September 1973, the Chilean military, led by Augusto Pinochet, staged a coup. Allende died during the takeover. Pinochet ruled for 17 years. Thousands were tortured, killed, or disappeared. The government had been removed, and democracy had not been restored. Then there was Panama in 1989. For years, Manuel Noriega had been a useful man to the United States. As Panama's de facto ruler, Noriega was a strongman, but he was our strongman. He cooperated with U.S. intelligence, assisted in regional operations during the Cold War, and helped Washington project influence in Central America. His corruption was tolerated, his brutality overlooked, until it wasn't. By the late 1980s, Noriega had become an international embarrassment. He was accused of drug trafficking, election interference, and repression. When he annulled Panama's 1989 election results and declared himself in a state of war with the United States, Washington decided the relationship was over. In December 1989, President George H.W. Bush ordered Operation Just Cause. U.S. forces invaded Panama with overwhelming firepower. The objective was explicit: remove Noriega from power. The invasion was fast and deadly. Entire neighborhoods were damaged. Hundreds of civilians were killed, though the exact number remains disputed. Noriega fled and eventually sought refuge in the Vatican embassy. What followed was one of the strangest sieges of the Cold War's end. U.S. troops blasted loud rock music outside the embassy day and night. Psychological pressure, I guess, designed to force surrender. And it worked. Noriega gave himself up. He was flown to Miami, tried in U.S. federal court, and then sentenced to prison on drug charges. For the first time, the United States had not only overthrown a foreign leader, it had prosecuted him as a criminal. The message was unmistakable. Alliance offered no immunity. Supporters of the invasion argued it restored democracy and protected the Panama Canal. Critics countered that it normalized regime change through force and blurred the line between international law and unilateral action. Either way, Panama marked a turning point. Regime change was no longer hidden behind covert operations or proxy forces. It was direct, public, and unapologetic. This last one many of you probably remember. Iraq 2003. Unlike earlier cases, Iraq was not covert at all. It was televised. The United States invaded Iraq to remove Saddam Hussein, citing weapons of mass destruction that were, never found. Saddam was captured, however, tried by Iraqi authorities, and then executed. The regime was gone, but so was the state. The invasion dismantled Iraq's institutions, triggered sectarian violence, and fueled insurgency and destabilized the region for decades. It was the clearest demonstration of a recurring truth, that removing a leader is not the same as building peace. The History Brief. The following comes from the 2016 book Strange History by the editors of Portable Press. The Cheddarman and Mr. Target. Cheddar, England, is famous for its cheese, but it's also famous for the limestone caves that lined Cheddar Gorge. In 1903, a Stone Age skeleton was discovered in one of these caves. He was called the Cheddarman. Scientists believe that he died 9,000 years ago. He was about 23 years old, stood 5 feet 5 inches, and had really strong teeth. An even more astonishing discovery, however, was made in 1997 when Britain's HTV network produced a documentary about the cave. The filmmakers obtained a DNA sample from Cheddarman's bones and wanted to compare it to DNA samples taken from Cheddar's schoolchildren. To prove to the kids that it was safe, their history teacher, Adrian Target, had his DNA swabbed as well. When all the tests were completed, only one person tested was found to be related directly to the Cheddarman, Mr. Target. All these years later, Mr. Target still lives within walking distance of the cave. I guess we all have 9,000-year-old ancestors, he said. I just happen to know who mine is. Thank you so much for tuning in once more and making this little show such a mighty success. If you'd like to help with the production of this show, please feel free to visit our Patreon page, which you can find at www.historyshortspodcast.com. You could also just buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com, the link which is also found on our website. If you have any questions, you can email me at peter@historyshortspodcast.com. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you all again tomorrow.